Hello, today I wanted to take on the oft-spoken but grossly inaccurate claim that all men only want one thing, with this counterblast. Men only want two things, and those two things make perfect sense if you understand what men really are and why men desire those things. So to help us with our understanding today, I brought this note card that I found discarded in the hallway, written by a student. On this side you see it says characteristics of living things. You can tell this is from a student and not me based on the handwriting. Then on the back side here they have 7. I usually teach that there are 6. Number 1, all things are made of cells. Number 2, growth and development. Number 3, reproduction. Number 4, contain DNA. Number 5, require energy, metabolism. Number 6, organized order. And number 7, homeostasis. Now, whether or not you agree with this list or not, there are a couple on here that are the reason for this post and that are consistent with this claim. At the end of the semester in my biology classes, I will tell my students when we're talking about genetics that the ultimate goal of every cell is to make a copy of itself, that reproduction is the entire function of a biological organism. And so it is completely inaccurate and unfair to judge men for behaving according to the biological portion that resides within them. All these other things are orchestrated in order to do that. Okay? The cells are there so we can reproduce. We grow and develop because that is reproduction. None of you are the same size you were when you were born, and none of you are comprised of entirely the exact same cells you had when you were born. So some of your cells have made copies of themselves in order to replace cells that were spent or to enable you to grow into the size and the shape that you are now. DNA, we're right in the middle of a pandemic. Basically, the virus that we're all afraid of now is a strand of DNA enclosed inside of a protein envelope. That's all it is. So DNA exists in order to give a cell instructions in order to make a copy of itself and preserve the DNA. There's a book called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, which sort of deals with this. It has a lot of other topics in it, and I recommend it because it's illuminating and it's, in some ways, supports these conclusions and this hypothesis. The energy that we get, the homeostasis we maintain, the organization that we have is all designed so that we can reproduce at the right time, in the right place, with the right species, and have a viable, healthy hemiclone of ourselves. So the things that men want, there's nothing evil in that men want them. And I'm going to tackle them individually and then talk about the reason why this is a misplaced and anachronistic criticism of men. Number 1, all men want to eat. This is maybe the reason why they say sometimes that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Eating is essential to life. I don't care what kind of an organism you are, the way in which organisms eat is different, the way in which they get nourishment is different. And contrary to popular belief, plants do not use the sun's energy to make energy. They use the sun's energy to make food. And then they break down that food to make energy. So the way plants get nourishment is different. But they metabolize it the same way we do, ironically. They just have functions we don't have. Fungi break things down that are already dead usually, or they're dying. Bacteria and viruses usually co-opt the host in order to make food and help them reproduce. But all men want to eat. And so that's not a reason to be critical of men, because it is a biological necessity. It's right here. It says, require energy, metabolism. It is essential for our growth and development, and ultimately for our reproduction. And forget whether or not we're talking about kids at this point. Eventually, whether you like it or not, cells from your skin will flake off, or in the middle of your mouth, or the stomach lining will shed, and you will have to replace the cells. And so reproduction, whether you ever have a kid or not, is essential. And if you don't eat, your cells cannot repopulate themselves. You've heard the saying, maybe starve a fever, feed a cold. The reason why you have to feed a cold is not to feed the yeasty beasties inside of you. The reason you have to feed a cold is because your immune system is going to go out there and it's going to start causing your own cells to commit suicide so that the viruses or bacteria that are inside of them will die too and not break free and infect other cells. So you have to replace those. Keep that in mind next time you get sick. feet of cold. So eating or nourishment is a natural biological urge. And so to criticize men because we eat, or because we want you to make us a sandwich, or because we're obsessed with food, or maybe the wrong foods, well, at least we're eating, and you have to eat. I don't care. But that's one of the two things men want. All men want to eat. Number two, all men want to reproduce. There's this biological machismo among men about being able to brag about their kids or brag about how many they have. Even in religious organizations, there is the aphorism that happy is the man who hath his quiver full, children are an heritage of the Lord. So, a man who is criticized because he wants to reproduce or rehearse for reproduction is to criticize the very existence of man and to some degree, attack manliness itself. Because man primarily, and most other organisms, most of the other animal organisms, are the ones that are the showy ones. You look at ducks, you look at swans, you look at other animals, even penguins, even though they're sort of visually indistinguishable, it is the male who does the dance and the performance and who offers something to the woman in order to get their attention. For some reason, females in humans put on makeup and strut around and wear high heels and dance provocatively, and I haven't figured that out yet because there is some female behavior that shows that they still recognize whether or not a man is peacocking. So, reproduction, normal, perfectly acceptable, and I love penguins because it's the only other species on the planet of which I am aware that proposes to a mate by giving it a shiny rock. Of course, they're just shiny rocks, they're not diamonds, but as long as she doesn't know it's a CZ, who will tell her, right? And she's not going to, she's not going to want to believe that you cheated her. So anyway, reproduction is a normal thing. It's a thing that men want to have kids. They want to reproduce. They want to sow their wild oats, so to speak. And it is biologically advantageous, according to Richard Dawkins, for a man to have as many partners as possible because woman can only raise a certain number of kids at a time, but a man can sire as many as he wants at a time. And so most of the population, if you look at it, stems from a common ancestor, and it's usually not a virtuous or praiseworthy one. In fact, we all know that it's the poorest among us, whether you've watched Idiocracy or not, and the most morally reprehensible among us, if you're not aware of John Lackland, King of England's 23 illegitimate children, that it is usually the miscreants and the malcontents who have the most offspring. And so this whole genealogy thing and find your DNA and brag about your ancestry is really a canard, because if you go back far enough, everyone has a villain in their family tree, and some of us have really bad ones. Mine's John Lackland, in case you were wondering. But reproduction is normal. Everybody wants to go out there and repopulate the world with little hemiclones of themselves, whether they consciously admit it or not. I say everybody. There are a few people who don't, and there are some who can't, but it is a natural biological urge and drive and teaching of religion, and so pretty much this is a ubiquitous thing to reproduce. And so criticizing a man who wants to reproduce or who wants to rehearse for reproduction in the case that he actually wants to have an offspring with you is denying his biology and denying your own. The final thing, which is not one of the two things that men want, because those are the only two things all men seem to want, is how this is phrased in order to clothe men with a naked villainy. Okay? And this is under the misbegotten notion that it is only men who want these things, that it is only men who want to reproduce, and it is only men, and that they're evil because they want it. Well, it's not just men. In every species, in every cell, in every organ system, in every tissue, every cell in every body is trying to make a copy of itself. Maybe not literally speaking, but making a hemiclone of yourself, or an offspring, a child, is a way to perpetuate what is in all of the cells of your body. It is a way for the DNA, for your characteristics, for your character, for your legacy to be perpetuated, at least in part, into future generations. Radio talk show host and author Mark Levin once said, 100 years from now, most people won't remember who you are or what you did. What you are really leaving behind is your family. And biologically speaking, it is exactly that you are leaving behind, because your brain cells can't make copies of themselves after a certain point. The ganglia are formed, they don't reproduce, Your stem cells make copies of themselves, but they're not exactly the same because stem cells differentiate. So the way in which all cells guarantee that a copy of them is made in some way or fashion is for you to have offspring. This is true in every organism. Bacteria reproduce, viruses reproduce, fungi reproduce. How else did you think I get here? I'm a pretty fun guy, right? Plants reproduce, protists reproduce, animals, elephants, giraffes, birds, scorpions, what have you. Every single thing. So to protract the notion that it is only men who want to reproduce and that somehow that is folly and vile, virulent vermin does a disservice to every living thing and biology in its entire. It is also not a truth because women want this too. Women say this sometimes, I think, with the misbegotten implication that they're not biological organisms. And I'm sorry, but they are. There's nothing unbiological about a woman, and since a woman is biological, she also has the exact same things. Women's cells also reproduce. There is not a woman on the earth I know who is the same size and has exactly the same cells she has when she was born. And so every single one of them has reproduced for growth, development, and as they age, to replace cells that are worn out, to build new ones so that they can get bigger and stronger and then more mature, hopefully. So women reproduce too. So the misbegotten notion that it is only men who want to reproduce is folly in its entirety because women want to reproduce too, even if it's just subconsciously. Maybe you know someone in their 30s or 40s who is jonesing and jazzed up about finally having a baby. I've got a neighbor who wants to introduce me to a 39-year-old that she knows who's a really nice girl and wants to have a family. And I look at that and think, a 39-year-old is only finally now interested in having a kid? But it happens because whatever other priorities she's had, in the end, she wants to reproduce too. Maybe not the same way or for the same reasons as a man, but women want that too. Women just get away with it because they want other things or because they can claim virtue in wanting these other things, as if men don't want them. Men want a peaceful world. Men don't want to have to fight because if we fight, we have to die or we lose stuff, particularly our women. And women dress up their naked villainy in odd ends stolen forth from Holy Writ in order to seem saints when mostly they play the sinners. I think it was Steve Harvey who said once that women are the gatekeepers. They're the ones who determine whether or not a man reproduces, with rare exceptions, because men can force a woman, but women can also force a man to not. And the very beginning of that is dating. They can always swipe left, or they can turn you down and say, well, I'm really not ready for a relationship, or I just don't feel like it, or, you don't have a 32-inch waist, and so you're not skinny enough for me. No, I'm not bitter about that one at all. And so they're the ones who ultimately determine who reproduces. In fact, Richard Dawkins suspects that 33% of children on the planet are being raised by men who are not their fathers, and that some significant fraction of men, as high as 60%, don't ever actually have kids. I happen to think it's about 20% of men who are completely excluded and do not ever reproduce. And then there's a small fraction of men, the percentage is ambiguous, of men who just decide they don't want to deal with it and they're done. I could count people like maybe Rush Limbaugh in that he's had other things on his mind and now he's too old and he really doesn't care. And maybe I'm wrong and maybe he wanted to have a kid and maybe he has a kid and he just doesn't know about it. But there are men out there who just, like we'll pick on Nikola Tesla because I know he never had any kids. He wasn't interested in women. He was in love with a pigeon. But she was probably female. So he had the same urges. He just didn't act on them. And so when a woman says a good man doesn't want that thing, there's no such thing as a good man, because all men want to reproduce. There's a reason why they court women. It's for a chance to reproduce or at least rehearse the reproductive acts, to have a chance to leave something behind, to have a chance to leave a legacy. And so everything that we do, all the courting, all the shenanigans, the changing of our wardrobes, changing of our addresses, changing vocations, getting a fancy vocation in the first place, buying a new car, upgrading your house, taking you on a date, dressing up fancy, trying to impress you, learning to cook, learning to do laundry, acting like a doormat. That's all with the premise, whether they want to admit it or not, that they have hopes of mating with you. So you're right, there is no such thing as a nice guy if you define a nice guy as a man who isn't interested in coitus. Because all of us would like to have an opportunity, whether we can bear children or not. Nobody wants to be alone. Nobody wants to be lonely. And nobody wants to live their life feeling that they weren't loved. There are plenty of nice men out there. A nice guy is someone who is willing to respect your timetable and treat you in a manner that shows that he's interested in you for more than a moment of pleasure, that he's interested in building a life with you, not just creating one in your womb. Because ultimately, even the ones you call nice guys are hoping one day to have someone with whom to mate, whether or not there are any offspring. We all deserve love. We all seek love. We all desire love. And treating men as if they're unlovable because they're biological shows that maybe you're not a real woman. There is nothing irreverent or untoward about reproduction. We are biological organisms. Our willingness to reproduce, the frequency of our reproduction, and what we're willing to do with and for those with whom we reproduce is what makes the difference between us and the rest of the Shropshire sheep in the world, the rest of the Cocker Spaniels out there who are just yapping to get one thing and one thing only. Yes, all men want that, not for the reasons that you unjustly ascribe to them. But even if they do have unrighteous desires or reasons, there is nothing evil about wanting to be the biological organism that you are. Sheep are not embarrassed to be sheep. Ducks are not embarrassed to be ducks. Mushrooms are not embarrassed to live in shit. And bacteria and viruses are not ashamed at all to invade you, co-opt your cells in order to make copies of themselves. But shaming men as the only organism that is shamed, well, that's pretty tacky. I don't know what it says about you, but it doesn't say about men what you think it does when you say they all want one thing, especially now that we know they all want two, and that both of them are consistent with life itself. It's food for thought. This is your scientific and philosophical thought for the day. If you have love, I celebrate that. If you haven't found anyone yet, I hope that you do. If not, at least for now, know that I am in your company and I appreciate your concerns and that you're not alone. This is a normal biological thing, and there is nothing wrong about desiring an opportunity to be with somebody and mate with somebody that you really love and with whom you want to build a life. Godspeed and good luck.